and welcome to another edition of the Mediatwits. We're back from summer hiatus, and we're going to be talking about the limits of plagiarism in the digital age with a BuzzFeed reporter being fired for 41 instances of lifting passages from Wikipedia, Yahoo Answers, and plenty of other sources, and then a writer at the New York Times also having a correction done after lifting a phrase from Wikipedia. How far does plagiarism go, and how much is just laziness? Before we get into our discussion, I want to tell you about our podcast is sponsored by Squarespace, providing everything you need to create an exceptional website for you and your business. Squarespace gives you beautiful templates, an easy interface, and even a free domain name. Try Squarespace for free at squarespace.com/MediaShift and save 10% when you use the offer code MediaShift. We're also hosted and sponsored by NextSpace and NextKids Potrero Hill in San Francisco, offering co-working space and adjacent daycare for infants and toddlers. Learn more about their pioneering program at bit.ly/NextSpacePH. And learn more about NextSpace co-working spaces around the country at nextspace.us. And we're actually coming to you from NextSpace, as you can tell with the beautiful orange background. I've been working here the last month, and my baby is actually in the Next Kids area. So it's a pretty fun place. Kids all over the place, crawling around. So it's a fun environment. So before we get into our discussion on the podcast, I want to introduce our panel. We have Alex Leo, editor-at-large at Newsweek, joining us. Dylan Byers from Politico, Erik Wemple from the Washington Post, Fannie Cohen, our producer, and Kelly McBride from Poynter. And let's start with you, Kelly. You're kind of an expert on plagiarism as an ethics person at Poynter. I'm sure you've seen so many cases over the years. Is there something that sets us apart, kind of copying from Wikipedia and the way, I mean, the sharing culture has really changed online. People are constantly, especially BuzzFeed is known for kind of using a lot of images and pulling from other sources online. Is the lines of plagiarism and laziness, are they kind of fuzzy at this point?
You know, I don't think they're fuzzy. I think in this particular case, with these two examples, it's because of the institution, and because they're very different institutions that we're talking about them. So, I mean, the New York Times, anytime the New York Times has some sort of plagiarism, we're going to talk about it because it's the New York Times. And BuzzFeed, I think because so many people have seen BuzzFeed shift from an organization that really didn't have a lot of editorial standards to one in which they're trying to create and enforce editorial standards. And the way this one played out, with people pointing out that that Benny had been plagiarizing, and then with Ben Smith defending him first, and then going back and doing an investigation and discovering that actually he wasn't very defensible. I think that it's more the organizations and their history that has us talking. But I think the definitions of plagiarism are pretty clear. And I investigate lots of plagiarisms every year. I don't find that even when I talk to plagiarists that they're confused about what it is. When they do it, it's mainly because they're rushed, because they don't know what other skills to employ, or because they don't care. But it's not because they don't know what it is.
And you, Fannie's bringing up a story about patch writing. What's that exactly, and how does that differ?
So patch writing is more of an academic term, and it's where the writer doesn't have enough knowledge or authority about the subject matter, and so he has to overly rely on his source material. So he might not understand the vocabulary, it might be too technical for him, or it might just be too foreign of a concept. We frequently see this with students who are maybe tackling a topic that's a little out of their range or their reach, and so before they do enough research in order to become experts and make a statement on a subject themselves, they rely heavily on other writers on the source material and the words and the phrasing that they're using, because they don't have the confidence to make statements and write sentences themselves about that particular topic. Some of what Benny was doing was definitely patch writing, but I'm not sure that it might have been I don't know what his motives were for doing that.
And Carol Vogel as well, she kind of lifted phrase from Wikipedia too. Erik, I'm curious, your colleague at the Washington Post, Gene Weingarten, kind of came out and said this whole, scandal at BuzzFeed was really bull poop or something along those lines. I know he's a humor writer, but his take was that, it's not theft if you're not really stealing anything of value. If you're just taking something that was put together on Wikipedia or Yahoo Answers or something, this really isn't that big of a deal. What do you think about his take, and what's your take on this?
I disagreed with Gene on that point simply because, one, it's, who do we anoint as the judge of intrinsic value, and who do we anoint the judge of what is really good writing and qualifies as real plagiarism. But I think that, Dylan and myself, we do a lot of posts. I think our lives would be a lot easier if all of a sudden we were licensed to do the things that Benny Johnson's did. In other words, lift from Wikipedia, lift from wherever, put those words in verbatim, not have to link to them, not have to quote to them. That would make our lives tremendously more easy. And I think that what Gene said devalues, there is a lot of work and there is some art in putting facts together in a concise, readable, and clear way. And I'm not a fan of anybody who lifts, sentences whole hog, puts them in his own copy, and then passes them off as his own work. It's a lie, because it is an act in which the writer or the reporter is presenting those facts as something that he arrived at or she arrived at through his own work, with his or her own, and that is that's false, and that's a problem. And so I don't agree with Weingarten on that. And plus, Benny did lift things that had a little more flair to them, at least one, and he lifted entire concepts from other websites as well. So I think that argument was bunk, especially as regards this particular case.
And Alex, do you want to jump in and talk about just the background of BuzzFeed? It wasn't really set up as a journalism organization. Now it has investigative journalists that we had on our show. They're really kind of changing their focus. What does this say about them?
So I worked at Huffington Post for 4 years in the early days, and Jonah Peretti is the founder of both BuzzFeed and Huffington Post with Ariana and Kenny Lehr. And the whole philosophy behind Huffington Post back in the day was kind of like being a mullet, business in the front, party in the back. And half of the people there were real writers, most of them based in D.C., most of them serious journalists. And then there were a bunch of content creators in New York who had no journalism background, including myself. I mean, I had been at ABC News before, but I didn't go to journalism school. I don't consider myself a journalist. I consider myself a writer, a content creator. I work in product mostly. And there was never a kind of understanding at either of these companies, I think, that the term editor and journalist shouldn't be used for people who aren't committing journalism in any way. And I think that understanding has not even permeated to this day. Benny is not a journalist, in my mind at all. He's a content creator. He puts together Jurassic Park GIFs to explain Egypt. That's not journalism. I don't see him ever having done an interview or having picked up a phone to get a comment. I mean, that's not committing journalism. And I think that the problem with organizations like Huffington Post and BuzzFeed, while it's a business model where the fun stuff pays for serious journalism to be done, is that you've blurred the lines completely between what is a serious practice with serious rules and something that we do on Tumblr for fun.
Do you buy that, Dylan, as far as people being, content creators and not really journalists if they're putting together entertaining content, or should they still be held to the same standard?
I do think that they should be held to the same standard. I do think that the lines are somewhat blurry, right? I mean, how do you define the difference between a journalistic act and just content creation is sort of a difficult one. I certainly think in the work that I do and say the work that Erik does, we are trying to cover many different facets of what's going on in the media. There are a lot of different things to cover. There's an expectation that you're going to produce a lot of content. Certainly that's an expectation for a BuzzFeed content creator or editor as well. And there's no way that you can have all of that information in your head at your disposal at any given time. And so you go to places like Wikipedia and you go to other news organizations and you look at what they're doing and you try and learn from them on the quick. And the difference is are you approaching that with the attitude, this is useful information, I'm going to take it and I'm going to cite it, or I'm going to reference the source that it came from, or do you just sort of cop out and think, you know what, it doesn't really matter, I'm just going to lift this wholesale and put it in my own words. And I think where part of that comes from, I think that there is a reluctance to credit people and a reluctance to sort of show your sourcing that might have
especially at Wikipedia. I mean, to cite Wikipedia is almost as bad as lifting from it.
Right, indeed, and people don't want to take the time to find the footnote and go to the bottom of the footnote and then do the research to find out what the actual source that Wikipedia used was. But I think this sort of reluctance to quote sources, I don't know if it has to do with an anxiety about feeling like you're not doing enough work if it's not an original thought. Like somehow if you're citing somebody else, or if you have to add a clause to every sentence that says according to, that somehow you're not giving any added value. And I think there's a desire to sort of like act like you're not aggregating when in fact you actually are aggregating. And I think that's part of the problem and that's part of the temptation that leads to plagiarism.
I think hopping on that with Dylan is that it's funny to me how many people wrote about this and didn't source from the original people that called out Benny Johnson for doing this, So all of these, Erik and Dylan both did. I saw Erik took great pains to talk about the people who had first called out Benny Johnson for doing these things. But when you're talking about source anxiety, a lot of the major brands that talked about this story didn't talk about the people that originally caused the uproar because they had found the sources of plagiarism in Benny Johnson's BuzzFeed posts.
One point I'd like to make is that, and Mark, sorry about that. One point I'd like to make is that I think that Benny, had he cited Wikipedia and all those listicles, would have been fine in terms of his standing with Ben Smith and his colleagues at BuzzFeed. After all, there are plenty of people at BuzzFeed who are totally hip and routinely practice linked journalism. I don't think that Carol Vogel would have been in good stead if she had acknowledged in the New York Times that she was was citing Wikipedia. I think there's a huge difference there, and so I think that and that it goes back to what you guys were discussing earlier.
But see, this I think gets to sort of my issue, is that there's a lot of journalism, particularly at the New York Times, that is very uncomfortable with citation. Like in a way, it's like it has to be our own idea, or it can't be anyone else's, right? Like we have to show that we've done the work on our end. We can't be an organization that just calls from other outlets. And the truth is that behind the scenes and behind the curtain, people are always calling from other outlets, always taking stuff from other sources. And I don't certainly if you start throwing citation everywhere, it becomes incredibly cumbersome to the reader. So I understand that concern. But I don't think an organization like the New York Times should be so worried about saying, I picked this up off of Wikipedia. Or if you are worried about it, then you have to put in the extra 2 minutes and not take it from Wikipedia.
Right. Also, what about just the way the internet is when it comes to sharing? I mean, it's hard. You see so many images and tweets and things are passed around so much. It might take you a lifetime to figure out where things came from. I mean, how do you attribute things when it's very hard to find the source?
Well, at the very least, you can be transparent that you don't know what the source is. I mean, the problem with citing Wikipedia is that a large portion of what's on Wikipedia has already been plagiarized from other sources. And there are people who are doing projects with Wikipedia that are demonstrating that on a regular basis. So there, I mean, you have. I think this goes back to what your motivation as a writer is, and or a content creator. And if your motivation is to create content in a way that is going to flow into a stream without any general purpose, it's really just to get clicks, you're not going to have a lot of concern about necessarily linking. But if your motivation is to be taken seriously in the marketplace of ideas, to be in conversation with other people who are talking about a particular idea, maybe trying to compete to see whose idea is better, you're going to be much more intellectually honest about where your ideas came from, because that's going to be important to you. And so this really does, this is why this is an institutional problem, not just an individual problem, is both of these institutions, BuzzFeed and the New York Times, have gone through different transitions about how they create content and what their role is in this broader marketplace of ideas. BuzzFeed is trying to assert itself as a group of serious journalists, and they recently came up with editorial standards. And when they did that, it turned out they had to go back and change some of their old copy because they realized that they hadn't been upholding those standards for, you know, and so, like, good for them for at least articulating a set of standards and then recognizing that they hadn't been living up to those standards, even though they thought maybe they had been. It's a really good starting point. But I still think... How
do they keep those standards, though? Because if the idea behind BuzzFeed is to churn out tons of content every day, people writing tons of stories, lifting a lot of photos, doing the things that they do, I mean, how do editors catch things like that? I mean, there might be some software you could use, but I mean, isn't this partially just the way they're run? I mean, how can you catch everything in that flow?
You obviously have to have a process that upholds your standards. And everybody here has a process for creating content, and within that process, you bake into it the quality control. Now, BuzzFeed probably hasn't done that yet. You know, the people that I talk to who work there, many of their posts go up and then they edit behind. That's probably not the same for Erik and Dylan. And if it is, there's still a process that they use to fact check their stuff and to make sure that their links are accurate and that they're making, you know, and they've been trained in that. And so you make sure that the people who are creating your content have been trained to uphold your standards. I haven't heard about BuzzFeed doing that kind of training. So it is a process, and you bake things into that process.
I always think it's interesting that... Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I always think it's interesting that people are so willing to overlook photos in this day and age when it comes to plagiarism and rights and talk about text. BuzzFeed is wildly guilty of stealing other people's images, and so was HuffPost, you know, until we came to a certain amount of standards. But, you know, you can't, there is no fair use for screen grabs as across the board. You know, like, most people can get away with it. But you can't just take these clips of television and claim fair use and, you know, not have a rock-hard legal system behind that. One of the things that I don't think many people do or know is that these images, Google has set up a system where you can check the original source based on the metadata of images. So if you're looking for who originally took that picture, back to your point of, like, how you find the original source, you can do that pretty easily in Google Images. There are ways of doing it. I just think that, and acknowledging if you can't is fine. But I wanted to also go back to Erik's point about stealing whole ideas as opposed to stealing individual things, because I think that's really interesting, and it's something that always comes into my mind, especially in that Daily Dot piece that argued that we need new rules for plagiarism. A lot of people have the same idea. If Fisher-Price comes out with a toy set about airline security, which it did, a lot of people are going to say, let's make a list of the worst toys ever made or the most boring toys ever made. It's not stealing if you have the same idea as someone. I think that the difference is you're lifting whole ideas that are unique and really owned in someone's voice. And BuzzFeed doesn't have a holistic voice, or, you know, a lot of the writers there don't have holistic voices that you can tell the exact difference between something being plagiarized and something not, because there's so few words and so many images.
So maybe there's a time where, like, PR agencies will sue journalists for just rewriting their press releases and lifting phrases from that.
We used to say ideas are promiscuous, but plagiarism, there's a pretty clear definition. And then what Alex is talking about with photos is copyright, which there's a very clear definition, and there are legal tests for when you are within fair use and when you aren't. And she's right. I mean, most of what you see in terms of photos on the internet are copyright violations.
Although, you know, BuzzFeed does have a good argument. There is a transformative use under fair use, and they are obviously transforming what the photo was originally for and making a commentary and making that list. But, it'd be interesting if and when they are sued. No, Erik, you're shaking your head.
Yeah.
I think in many cases that if they don't meet any of the 4 prongs for fair use under the Copyright Act. I think oftentimes they're just a pure lifting of a copyrighted photo, a pure violation. But it's such a jungle out there in terms of photographs, and the enforcement is so nil, and the consequences are so small that it's a pretty good business practice when you come to think about it. So I don't think that the listicles that I see on BuzzFeed I enjoy very much, but I don't necessarily view them as qualifying under the transformative leg of the fair use test. I don't know. Maybe you guys, others disagree with that.
Even under parody?
No, I'm not seeing it. I mean, I think that they're using a photograph in a commercial way, and it is, yeah, maybe once in a while, but I think that most of them are just using photographs to illustrate a point, just the way a news organization would use a photograph to illustrate a point.
Yeah.
Dylan,
I'm sorry. I was just going to bring up that list of the 23 photos that will make you feel better about the world. Like, that has no parody aspect. It's just images that will make you feel better about the world, but that's not transformative. Sorry, Dylan, go on.
No. And would they argue, I assume BuzzFeed would argue that we put very, very small links in very, very fine print at the bottom of each photograph, and that therefore they can get away with it. I mean, I think just listening to this conversation, what comes to mind is sort of, like a sort of like Dada artwork. If you just take a bunch of photos from various newspapers and magazines and picture books, and you sort of slash that together, and you put it together, and there's no credit for it, but you've organized it in such a way, and you say, okay, that is how I'm adding value to this, and so therefore I've provided some sort of added value. I've done some sort of function here that is journalistic or is at least artistic or something. And I think if you talk to Ben Smith, the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, who I should say was my former boss, I think he would say, like, look, these lists take a lot of work. It is not easy to be funny. It is not easy to be clickable. It is not easy to be compelling, and it takes a certain sort of sensibility and a certain sort of creativity to put this list together. Now, I don't know how true that is. That's a judgment call. I would say that whatever the case, if that is the sort of medium in which you deal, you are constantly tempting plagiarism, because you are always dealing with other people's work. You are always putting together this sort of like Dada artwork that is inherently borrowed or found.
Yeah, and I asked BuzzFeed, they've come on our show before, and they just kind of said, well, Ben's comment speaks for itself, and Ben did come out and call Benny Johnson, an original, deeply original writer, and then kind of had to take that back. It's a tough kind of situation for them, but maybe it's, like Kelly said, maybe it's a learning experience. Maybe it's something where they strengthen their editorial standards and they try to put in some system to deal with it. But it is a difficult situation when you're asking people to make, to do what they do best, and do it very quickly and respond to things as they happen, and still be original and still attribute and so on and so forth. But there's plenty of other sites that are working at high speed that do pull it off, like Business Insider, although they sometimes will lift a lot from other stories. But there's a definite fine line when people kind of rewrite AP stories or rewrite stories from other outlets too. That's gone on in journalism forever.
You're allowed to rewrite APs. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, it may be impossible for BuzzFeed to sustain significant editorial standards and do what they do. They may have, I mean, they're trying it, but it really may be impossible for them to do that.
I was going to say too that you're allowed to rewrite. Having worked at Reuters for years, you are allowed, if you're a paying customer of the AP or Reuters, you're allowed to rewrite that copy. That copy is yours to play with and add to, and the New York Times does it all the time. By the AP and X. And I know that they subscribe to those services at BuzzFeed, both for their photos and the copy. But that, when Ben Smith made our comment about how we have to train people in journalism better, people reacted really badly on Twitter to that, because people said you can't train people to not be liars or to not be thieves. But I think that you can train people in best practices for this kind of new age of journalism, which is always linking, always attribution. And what Dylan said really struck home. I think people are afraid to not seem original, but the best people are the best writers, the ones that I love, are the ones that are always taking and giving me other people's ideas and sending me out, so they pull me back in.
As we were, to that point, as we were having this conversation here, and I'm watching TweetDeck go by, John Cassidy, a writer at The New Yorker, was informed by Twitter that the latest column he wrote, he proposed an idea about the 21st Century Fox Time Warner Cable merger that I think Peter Lorre at BuzzFeed had proposed 2 months ago. And he tweeted that, and John Cassidy got the tweet, and he said, "I'll give you a hat tip. I'll acknowledge that you did this 2 months before I did." And that, I don't understand why that's so hard for some people to just I mean, we're always borrowing from each other. We're always like being influenced by one another. I don't understand why it's so hard to just accept that and sort of factor that into your work.
Definitely. Well, thanks a lot. It's a great discussion, and I'm sure it's something that will continue to evolve and we'll be watching carefully and come back to. We want to thank our panel, Alex Leo from Newsweek, Dylan Byers from Politico, Erik Wemple from the Washington Post, Fannie Cohen, our producer, Kelly McBride from Poynter Institute. We want to thank our sponsors, Squarespace. You can get 10% off at squarespace.com/MediaShift using the MediaShift code, and also NextSpace and NextKids in Potrero Hill. We'll catch you next week. Thanks, everyone.